Today's networks are changing fast, and employees, devices, and infrastructures are more distributed than ever. Gigamon Threat Insight is a cloud-native, high-velocity network detection and response solution that's purpose-built to enable you to get in front of this transformation. Learn more at securityweekly.com/Gigamon. Optics has built a platform for SQL-powered security analytics. Extending the OS query agent, Optics collects, aggregates, and analyzes a wide range of system data and makes that available to solve multiple security challenges. Their solution provides visibility across Linux, macOS, Windows, containers, and cloud workloads. Their customers are using the Optics platform for fleet visibility, intrusion detection, investigation, and audit and compliance. Visit securityweekly.com/Optics and be one of the first to see how they've mapped over 500 behavioral rules to the MITRE ATT&CK framework. Enterprises struggle to detect advanced attacks quickly and thoroughly as evolving threats continue to evade current security tools. Skillful threat detection starts with diverse, high-value security telemetry to run detections on. The Chronicle platform allows security teams to store and analyze petabytes of data in one place so that you can quickly apply powerful detection rules against all of your security data. Learn more about the Chronicle platform and the latest threat detection capabilities at securityweekly.com/Chronicle. Welcome back to Enterprise Security Weekly. Learn how to conquer cloud complexity in our first Security Weekly webcast of 2021 on January 28th at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can register at securityweekly.com/webcast. This one will feature myself, Adrian, and Mike Lloyd from Red Seal. Super excited about that. Talking with Mike is just... he's an epidemiologist in the 80s. I'm always just hammering him with questions that seemingly don't relate to cybersecurity, but then we're like, oh no, wait, that does kind of relate to what we do. So it's always interesting, certainly with Mike. Also, if you need to check out any of our previous webcasts, which you should, securityweekly.com/on-demand. I am excited to have with us for this segment to discuss some defensive team techniques, as well as some of the, you might have heard SolarWinds stuff, Mr. Sean Metcalf and Tyler Robinson of Trimark Security. Welcome, guys.
Hey, Paul.
Thanks,
It's
Paul.
good to be back. I haven't been on Enterprise Security Weekly, but I've been on Security Weekly a couple times. So
That's right.
It's good to be on here chatting with you again.
Absolutely. Of course, Tyler's a regular host on Paul's Security Weekly. And is this your first time on ESW?
It is. I am very excited to be on ESW. It's definitely one that I try and catch up on, but I have not been on this one.
It's awesome. It's good to have you. I want to just start with you folks, and just for our audience here on Enterprise Security Weekly, what is Trimark Security, and what are you guys doing on a regular basis?
Sure. So Trimark Security, I founded Trimark about 5 years ago in order to fill in some gaps that I saw in the industry. We do red teaming, we do pen testing, these attack simulation sort of things, but there wasn't a really good security assessment on the market for Active Directory specifically. And pretty much every attack that happens in an enterprise today goes after Active Directory. So as a Microsoft certified master in Active Directory, I put together this security assessment to check all the different things that I could think of based on the security research that I've done and that of others to incorporate and really have this comprehensive review of the Active Directory security posture in an environment. We've since expanded into Azure Active Directory and Office 365 in order to assess those environments. And what we've seen in the news is that the attackers are going to go where the data is, where they can access and persist in the environment. And that often is in the Microsoft Cloud, specifically Azure Active Directory and the Microsoft Office 365 suite, as well as on-prem in Active Directory. So that's our core focus, but we've got some exciting things coming up in this new year.
It's awesome. And this is clearly your realm. I know enough to maybe be dangerous. I struggle to keep the terminology that Microsoft keeps changing. I'm like, wait, what's the difference between OneDrive and SharePoint? I'm confused. I'm really confused. It's Microsoft 365 now, not Office 3. They just keep changing names, making it even more confusing, right?
Yeah, we're going to continue calling it Microsoft Office 365 until such point that Microsoft doesn't have any more references to Office 365, because there's even license and subscription items that say Office 365. So I think to deconflict, we're just going to continue saying Microsoft Office 365, which just covers whatever that entity is at that time. But yeah, the name changes are annoying and they change frequently. I just can't imagine the level of effort it takes at Microsoft to update all the documentation when Windows Defender ATP changes to Defender for Endpoint. And then you've got to go and change all those references.
So when we talk about the SolarWinds attack, did that leverage some of Active Directory once they gained a foothold within the organizations? I would imagine that it would.
Absolutely. So attackers go after Active Directory because it is the identity and directory and authentication service for just about every business out there. I think something like 90 to 95% of organizations are running Active Directory. So it is a target because it's leveraged. It's leveraged because it's easy to implement, it's easy to manage. It's not so easy to secure based on people's configurations. I say that because out of the box, you're not going to have problems with Active Directory the way it's configured. It's when you start adding things like services, such as SolarWinds, and you add all these service accounts that are associated with those services, and there's rights that need to be configured for that. I did a tweet thread a few weeks ago when the SolarWinds really broke, and I went through the SolarWinds documentation to see what SolarWinds said you need to configure for each of the components of the SolarWinds product in order to monitor and manage those systems. Specifically in Active Directory, if you're going to install the agent on a domain controller, typically that's going to run a system. Anything that runs on system and a domain controller, well, you kind of own Active Directory. We have a big focus at Trimark talking with customers, looking at agents and installed software on domain controllers to identify those as additional control planes. Anything that has the ability to install or run code on a domain controller could potentially own Active Directory. So that includes the accounts that manage those systems that have that connectivity into domain controllers. For example, with SQL, you have to set it up as DB owner, which is, again, got access on SQL. In the Microsoft Cloud, Office 365, it said configure it as global administrator, or you could probably delegate it out some other way, which means pretty much everyone's going to configure that with global admin rights. And that's God in the Office 365 space. See, I did it. Microsoft Office 365
right.
space.
I still do it as well.
And then even on the Azure side, it says, well, use contributor rights or reader. Contributor has the ability to make changes and even run PowerShell system on Azure VMs. So as you can see, it just starts expanding out into all these different systems. And if you're using SolarWinds to manage and monitor Active Directory, you're using it to manage and monitor, say, even VMware on-prem, your Azure VMs in the cloud, Office 365, the compromise of SolarWinds then has the ability to compromise all these other things. And that's not even to talk about, say, Microsoft ADFS, which is the federation component that Microsoft has available for companies that are using Microsoft platform, which they are usually, such as Active Directory, in order to federate their cloud infrastructure environment from Active Directory. So the user can just log in easily to that web server that's a cloud SaaS app and just get access to it without having to do any additional authentication. All that magic kind of happens in the background because of federation. Well, with these ADFS servers, we've seen at Trimark that these aren't well secured. They're just treated as another server. So if an attacker has the ability to take over or control or have admin rights on that federation server, and I talked about this at DEF CON in 2017, it seems like forever ago, but if you're able to extract the signing certificate off of the ADFS or federation server, then you can impersonate anyone you want through that federation. So we heard of the golden ticket attack in Active Directory. This is very similar. It's been termed the golden SAML attack, where basically once you have that certificate, you then have the ability to create your own and forge your own certificates or tokens. Once you're able to forge your own tokens in order to connect to federated applications and systems. And at that point, you can say you're anyone. You can say you're the CEO. You can say that you're the admin.
Right. Now, Sean, I read something that the attackers that were behind the SolarWinds attack, that's what they were after, is that golden SAML ticket. Is that what you folks have found as well?
There have definitely been a number of attacks where the golden SAML type attack has been noted. The NSA has published some information about that. Microsoft has published it. It's one of those things that is easy for the attacker because those certificates are usually good for 2 years. So once you have a copy of that certificate or extracted that certificate information, which is not difficult, if you have admin rights to that system, you can then, again, forge whatever you want and impersonate anyone you want, just like the curb TDT on an Active Directory itself. So yeah, it is a big issue. Organizations have used Ping, Okta, other federation systems, third-party federation systems, If anyone could extract or access those certificates, which I'm sure they have pretty good controls around that, but it's the same sort of thing. So when you think about identity and identity being the current risk or the current threat, if an attacker can go after that identity and take control of that identity, or at least the systems, if they can take control of the systems that control and manage that identity, then they can impersonate the people that the people of interest, the targets of interest. And if one of the ways that FireEye was alerted to the SolarWinds issue from the beginning because the attacker added a new device to their MFA system. And that was the thing that triggered the whole investigation that FireEye did. So they were after that identity, and they recognized that in order to have continued access of that identity, they need to have a way to persist within the MFA configuration, even though they figured out a way to compromise the MFA system itself. The token, again, the signing certificate, the signing token for that MFA system is what they originally got. But then they wanted to think beyond that and persist. So as an attacker, you want to have several different methods of persistence, continue that access. But identity is the big thing these days, and that's what the attackers are going after, because identity equals access to data.
Tyler, sorry, did you have anything to add?
No, I mean, from that standpoint, really, we've seen this type of attack from most of the APT groups, most of the criminal syndicates. Even ransomware targets things in the same manner. You have to have credentials in order to do something. There's certain activities that an attacker or an attack core components that have to happen. Execution being one of them. You have to have some sort of identity, which is where your credentials come in. So things like federation, things like multi-factor, all of those things play into the attack scheme, and there's certain activities you've got to be able to audit and monitor. And that's not just Active Directory on your premise. That's your, Azure, your federation. If you're using AWS, your IAM. All of those particular pieces fall into, from a whole, an enterprise maturity and security model that you have to follow in order to have some of that visibility. Now, that being said, the SolarWinds is kind of one of those attacks. We've been kind of having this discussion at Trimark where should SolarWinds and should the people that are compromised by them, was there things that they could do to avoid this? And the simple answer is really no. From a supply chain attack standpoint and from SolarWinds, this is a far-reaching piece of software in which you are trying to deploy it. You need certain functionality, and that functionality requires certain levels of permissions. Those permissions may be far-reaching. So the more functionality you have, the more permissions you need. And so really from a supply chain attack, these companies are inherently have to trust certain software. And that's kind of part of the problem that we're seeing with this particular attack. However, there's visibility points, and obviously visibility points that FireEye was able to see, but maybe SolarWinds was not. And I don't think SolarWinds was actually the first place or the only target from a vendor standpoint or a supply chain attack standpoint that was targeted. They just happened to be the easy one that was far-reaching and the one that happened to be detected. So there's some interesting caveats and correlation to that.
Are there things that we can do? And it's interesting how it's the delegation of duties is put forth in enterprises, right? You've got the security team. Then you've got in larger enterprises, you've got the team that's responsible for Active Directory and Azure. Likely, could be even separate teams, right? As we get larger and larger enterprises, well, what do we do? What's the advice? I guess first from the security team. What should we be kind of conversations should we be having with our internal operations teams?
Yeah, I'll take this first, Tyler. I think the tough thing is that the fundamentals and the foundational items that we talk about all the time that always seem very boring or rote, the things like principal least privilege, separation of duties. As Tyler mentioned, the SolarWinds application or system is this thing that's far-reaching. It's monitoring and it's management. It has a lot of capability, and in order to leverage that capability, it needs rights across different systems, various levels of rights, often admin rights or close to admin rights. And the challenge with that is when you have this far-reaching, huge system with incredible scope and scale, with a lot of rights, compromise of that means compromise of pretty much everything, especially if it's configured and linked into Active Directory. Microsoft came up with this concept of the tiered model where you break out the different administration components with your most critical infrastructure being listed as a tier 0 component. And within that tier, you keep everything separate. So administration management of Active Directory stays in tier 0. Domain controllers are in tier 0. Federation servers like ADFS are in tier 0. So SolarWinds in that model would not have any rights to the domain controller unless it was a separate instance of SolarWinds within that. Well, that's a huge pain for operations to have to duplicate infrastructure. But really, it's a risk mitigation technique that limits the impact when something like this actually occurs. I hope that companies, even if they didn't have SolarWinds or that they weren't vulnerable to this issue, they are reevaluating all of their services and systems and the rights that they have across their systems to kind of tabletop what sort of impact it would have if any of these are compromised. This is not just a SolarWinds thing. This has happened before. It's going to happen again. There's going to be some sort of major impact or effect where someone has control of a system and the system is deployed broadly. Because of the access, because of the capability it has, it can do a lot of things. And as Tyler mentioned, that's what it was purchased for. I think we're going to have to start separating out monitoring and management a little bit better, so that way we can control what has read-only access for monitoring and what has admin capability from the management perspective, and then really start looking at these tiering models. But as I said, I think the important thing that companies can do today is to make sure that the correct things are being audited on their domain controllers, their federation servers, within their cloud environment, that those are being fed into a central logging and alerting system. And then in addition to that, they're also reviewing the rights that these service accounts have, often very high level rights like domain admin in Active Directory, as well as the rights within Azure AD. Those service accounts we find often are in global administrator. They have very powerful rights. And in the cloud, it's the Wild West. There's all these applications, many of which I've never heard of before. At least in the AD space, I'm familiar with a lot of them. So it's difficult to provide recommendations around that when vendors are available and provide some capability. The company does some due diligence, they get the vendor in. And as Tyler said, with SolarWinds, what would you do to stop this? Mm-hmm. It starts with principal least privilege. It starts with reviewing the rights and pushing back on vendors when you think that the rights are too extensive or too broad or too privileged.
Yeah, that really, that's the key right there, is preventing this becomes much less the exercise over what's your time to detection and time to remediation. That delta between your ability to detect and have the visibility and capability to detect, and then the delta for your teams to effectively respond to and remediate those alerts. That's where you start to see the more mature environments and their abilities and capabilities of their teams really start to shine, or you start to see the gaps. And that's often where we see pen tests and different assessments. That's where we see some of the value that is provided, but there's still a lot of gaps there, and there's still a lot left to be had from an enterprise wanting. I think one of the other big critical areas that we really have to start focusing on is outside of the technology realm. We need to get the buy-in and collaboration and cooperation of each of these asset owners from the top down. We have to have that support, and we have to have things such as the Active Directory team working in close conjunction with the server team or the deployment team. Help desk needs to understand the Active Directory infrastructure and the rights that they hold and what they're actually capable of doing, and make sure that those are properly in align with the security team. And so all of those communication channels and collaboration between each of the teams becomes much more effective from a business standpoint. Those teams need to also understand the business. If we don't understand the business, like Sean said, some of the recommendations or remediations may affect operations such that it's not a good business risk decision. At the end of the day, we are capitalists. The company is in it to make money. And if we hinder that via security, that needs to be well evaluated and understood so that we know that what we're doing is appropriate and fits the business model and makes sense from a business standpoint. If you're going to spend $100,000 for something that is going to provide you, $30,000 of mitigation, that doesn't make sense from a business standpoint. Yeah. So we really do have to understand the business.
You guys live this every day, right? And I've broken it down, I think earlier this week on Business Security Weekly, that controls introduce friction, right? And that's,
yes.
And I'm sure you've seen so many organizations, right? You walk in, you're like, wow, you guys have everything configured perfectly. No, that usually
communication can grease that friction. Yeah. You really do need that buy-in and that good collaboration and relationship. Honestly, like business everyday business is relationship. And that even if you're in the technical field and you deal with computers all day, if you're not out there building those relationships and making sure that you have buy-in and help, and that's give and take from both an empathy and a sympathy standpoint, and help the teams through communication in the other departments, you're not going to effectively run a good program and a smooth running business.
Yeah, and Tyler hit on it right there. The empathy and sympathy. The environments that we've seen that are secured the best are the ones where operations doesn't just do operations. They look at things from a security perspective too. They may even have some security roles within operations. And security and operations works very closely together. In the security team, they have some people that understand operations. You have to have that understanding of both to really be effective in getting things done. Too often, security throws something over the fence and says, okay, disable NTLM. And operations is like, we can't do that. That's just not possible. In any kind of environment or most environments. So they start to go, all right, well, these recommendations just aren't feasible. We can't implement them because there's just not anything we can do. So we'll just put it on the shelf and deal with it later. And unfortunately,
but even
the things
worse,
that
Sean,
really should be done often get grouped into that as well. So it does take that empathy of what operations is dealing with. They're fighting fires all the time. I mean, when I was an AD admin, I wasn't thinking about all these different security components or even really knew about them because it's a full-time job keeping up to it. That's what we do at Trimark.
Right. And I think even worse, Sean, is,
it's complicated to manage AD these days.
You put a control in place, let's say it's NTLM, right? And they implement it, but then it introduces friction and then they back it out. And then what's the communication path back? So oftentimes I've found that communication path gets broken and it doesn't come back up until there's an assessment or some kind of pen test. And the security team's like, wait a minute, we agreed that this was going to be turned off, this control was going to be in place to mitigate it, but it's not. That's the difficult thing to me.
Right. Yeah, and some of the environments I've seen that have had, say, more security challenges are the ones where users could push back on that friction and say, look, these security controls are stopping me or slowing me down from doing my business or my work. And then the business people said, all right, well, let's remove that friction. Let's remove those controls. And so everything was open and it was a very bad situation. So there's definitely got to be a balance. And so understanding the business, as Tyler mentioned, and understanding what operations is doing and what they need to do to get their job done, especially when operations and security report to different management chains. So they have different priorities, different budgeting, different things they need to get done. And the security items often aren't part of that unless the security and operations works very well together and have that good relationship, because it starts with a relationship, like Tyler said. Some of the best environments I've seen have been where the head person or the blue team lead and the red team lead or the security lead and the operations team lead, they meet up like once a month at least and know each other well by a first name basis and maybe have gotten lunch together before and talk about the challenges they have, the things that they want to do, because it's got to be a collaborative thing.
Adrian?
So question for you, Sean, and I think you've answered part of it, but the next SolarWinds, there's a lot of software that most companies have to evaluate. Is the best place to start looking at those service accounts and looking at what access they have? What's the best place to find the riskiest stuff, and prioritize that work of finding those applications and just finding a starting point to prevent whoever the next target is?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think it starts with categorizing systems, as painful as that sounds, but even from a basic level. What's critical? What's the most important things we have? We have Active Directory. Okay, so domain controllers are critical. We have data stored in SQL servers and other database servers. So we're going to label that critical. This data is very important. If it gets leaked or exposed, then that's bad. And then go from there. Then you're looking at the accounts, the administrative accounts, accounts with access, groups that access to those systems, as well as service accounts. Within Trimark, we have an internal knowledge base of known named service accounts, so the different types of names that we've seen for specific products. So whenever we do an assessment, we identify that these service accounts that have similar names or close to that link to this product, and we have an idea of what sort of rights that product typically requires. The other thing that we've seen is that a product was installed 15, maybe 20 years ago. Well, the security model of that product 15 years ago could be very different than it was 5 years ago. So I would say start with identifying those service accounts and that inventory of services, systems, So starting with Active Directory, looking at which ones are highly privileged, so they're in administrators or domain admins or one of the privileged groups within there, and identify what is the system associated with that. Reach out to your vendor and say, hey, is there an update? Is there a way that we can do this without domain admin? We actually have about 6 or 7 case studies where we've identified how to reduce the rights from domain admin down to much less than that. By using delegation in order to provide access that is required without using domain admin or administrators. Because very often the vendor says that's what they need, but then a few years down the road, that changes. We were actually quite happy we were able to get a major vendor to change their documentation from saying they needed domain admin rights to actually just user rights and the ability to join a computer to the domain.
They didn't actually check.
It starts with that
just being
inventory
lazy, right?
of the systems, the service accounts associated with them, what rights they have, which can be complicated because not everything's in AD. So in that SQL server, you could go ahead and add a bunch of groups within AD to have different rights within SQL. So you have to go to SQL, you have to go to those applications to check. That's why it's important to do that categorization. And then figuring out what rights they have, and then tracking down, okay, what are the rights that they need today versus maybe what they needed before.
And some of that really does come down to communication again, right? Like from the business standpoint, talk to your business leaders, talk to the executives and the asset owners. What is the sensitive things in our environment? What do we make money on? And what would be the fatal blow if this was compromised? Maybe that's PII, maybe that's not. Maybe that's your IP or intellectual property. So not just taking your identity and the services and things that run on the identity control, which is in AD, the domain controllers, but looking at where the data actually lives and categorizing that data in those servers that manage things like Azure Connect or the databases that handle all of your sensitive information. So making sure you're having those communications and really do understand not just what you think the business is or what is sensitive in the business, but what actually makes the business important and makes us money.
Yeah, and the toughest thing with the SolarWinds issue is that the company did their vetting. Like these organizations that had SolarWinds, they did their vetting. Who uses SolarWinds? They went to the website, saw all these companies that use it.
Right.
They said, these are the capabilities we want to use. They installed it. They kept it up to date. They did all the things that they were supposed to. Let's say that they even installed it per the vendor documentation. So at that point, it's an issue of how do we best mitigate if this sort of thing happens again? I was speaking with an executive at a Fortune 500 in the past few weeks about this, and they just didn't have a vulnerable version of SolarWinds configured. They got lucky because it didn't update. So, you have the situation where, okay, you had a vulnerable version, but you weren't on the target list, so therefore the kill bit was applied, or you didn't have a vulnerable version and it didn't happen anyway. So, going through this process, I think the contracting process also needs to go hand in hand with the system owners themselves, having a good understanding of what are these products that are being purchased that are supposed to do all these capabilities, and what is the risk of doing that? The risk assessment beyond just, okay, what does SolarWinds have as far as their third-party, vendor analysis? How do they do code updates, things like that? But really, what are the rights that are required, and what is the risk to our organization if we deploy it with everything turned on and the rights deployed as per the documentation?
That's that security mindset. Like, go ahead.
And then how do you do that in a POC when you're planning on buying a product? I mean, that's the really tough thing I see. Like a lot of people don't even have test environments for their POCs, and a POC is something they don't have time for anyway because they're putting out fires. So, I mean, that gets challenging to try and figure that out before you buy a product.
Right. And I would say the number one question I ask is, does this need admin rights? And how can we do it without it having admin rights? This situation of agent versus agentless that we've been going back and forth for years. I've been in the industry for like 20 years now, and it seems like we keep bouncing between agent and agentless. You get an agent installed on the computer, then you end up with 20 agents, right? But agentless means that there's potential credentials being dropped on the system.
Yep.
I've seen inventory systems, massive inventory systems that scan the whole environment, gather information from those systems to pull it into a central inventory, database, and these inventory systems have tremendous rights. They have admin rights on everything. So it's not just a SolarWinds issue. This is a systemic issue that we have because we need these products that are able to have capability across a lot of different types of devices. And very often they need admin rights to do the thing that they were purchased or acquired to do. So at that point, we need to look at credential management of those service accounts. So first of all, identifying that those are the actual rights that are required for that service account, but then how can we manage that? So this is somewhere where actually an enterprise password vault might make sense, because the credential could be used and then the credential could be changed immediately after it was used. So that way, if it was exposed, then there's some sort of mitigation there. Or even a situation where it doesn't have full-time privileges, it gets the privileges to do certain things, and then it gets pulled back. But ideally, and the thing that we recommend, especially with scanning accounts, vulnerability scanning accounts, which typically are in domain admins, is to break those out. Have one service account for your workstations, have one for servers, have a different one for domain controllers. That just mitigates if that credential is stolen or lost, or if the system blips and it's left behind on a computer somewhere. That doesn't solve the core problem of this system that we're using to scan everything has rights to everything. And that's going to be a problem that is a hard problem. It absolutely is a hard problem to solve. But I would say starting with the categorization, moving to the inventory of the service accounts and what rights they have, and then looking to see if there's a way to mitigate how long that system has those rights, or even credential management of the service accounts associated with it can be very helpful. And then the monitoring, obviously, the auditing and tracking of what are these systems doing.
Sound advice.
This is just the beginning, right? Like SolarWinds is the tip of the iceberg. There were companies, like government was obviously a critical target and was heavily influenced and infiltrated via this. But there were also technology companies that we rely on for things like drivers, for things like agents. I mean, VMware, NVIDIA, Intel, Cisco. There was a list of very large companies. So this may have just been the volley attack, where we do have to start getting our house in order, making sure that those other tech companies, those other agents, the other providers that we rely on and trust in our environment, those are now well secured, because there may be another round of this and it may be more severe. So really ensuring that you're doing the right thing, figuring out what the root cause is, which is your identity and the permissions and privileges that you're allowing vendors and supply chains to access your environment. That's a risk and a business risk that needs to be mitigated.
Right. And there are some free tools to check these things. So at Trimark, we published at trimarksecurity.com, we published actually hub.trimarksecurity.com. We published over the summer a free PowerShell script that can be used to gather some information. We have a blog post that's associated with that, where it breaks down, here's the things that you should look at. Here are the recommendations to configure these. Part of that is looking at the administrators, the Active Directory administrators in the environment. CrowdStrike released a tool over the past couple weeks called CRT. I forget what the actual acronym stands for, but it helps you scan your Azure AD and Office 365 environment for some of the things that could be potential issues. CISA.gov, the Critical Infrastructure Security Agency, released a tool they called Sparrow, which can be used against Azure AD Office 365 in order to check application permissions, and it also scans the unified log for potential issues or permissions or configurations, or even attack activity in the environment. So I'd highly recommend looking at those, especially for the cloud environment, and then also checking your AD environment for those low-hanging fruit, those things that can be resolved fairly quickly, as well as some of the things that may take a little bit more time.
Oh, that's awesome. Great advice. Sean and Tyler, thank you so much for appearing on this episode of Enterprise Security Weekly. Adrian and Tyler, thank you. Awesome show. Glad to have everyone. Thank you, everyone, for listening and watching, and we'll see you next time.